Good afternoon. This does work. There are so many important people in this room that I want to, but I can't mention the 10 or 20 who have done so much to make our world better. But I will introduce these two people, and I will also offer an apology for personally being a bit late. I don't know how the rest of you navigate the Munich Security Conference. I've been here, this is my 19th year, and you just run back and forth, and there was even no time for us to talk to each other. So, apologies. And as Kofi Annan said, when you were a politician, you used to know how to do this. Well, I guess the muscle memory has faded. But welcome to the first of two fireside chats this evening on technology's impact on democracy. It's a very small topic. We'll cover it in 5 minutes. I have long said that politicians are analog and the challenges today are digital. If you're a politician, you make a list of what we don't like, and by the time that becomes law, everything has evolved and the list is irrelevant. Politicians are not good at thinking in 3 dimensions, and this world is now clearly in at least 3, maybe 5 dimensions. I think Elon Musk thinks it's in 5 dimensions. But we are lucky to have 2 very experienced panelists who come to this topic from different worlds. Neither of them is a politician. That's a good start. One is from the public sector and the NGO sector, and the other is from the private sector. And they will each talk for a few minutes about their views on the subject. Born and educated in Ghana, Kofi Annan took his first job at the UN in 1962. Most of us in this room remember 1962, as a budget officer at the World Health Organization. Leadership roles at the UN Emergency Force, UNHCR, and UN peacekeeping operations followed before he was appointed the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. Awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2001 jointly with the UN for bringing new life to the organization, he obviously is someone who thinks creatively. Mr. Secretary Kofi, you said a few years ago at your alma mater, MIT, quote, "Let us invest in and embrace technology. It makes progress possible, but technology does not free us of the need for leadership. It makes leadership all the more important." That's a hugely important sentence. I'm reading it again. Technology does not free us of the need for leadership. It makes leadership all the more important. And you continued, "So let us not forget that technology by itself cannot absolve us of our political responsibility to ensure that we use it wisely and efficiently for the good of society everywhere." We'll talk about that in a bit. Eric Schmidt's training was slightly different. An engineer. His PhD dissertation at Berkeley focused on controlling large software development in a disturbed environment. We certainly have a disturbed environment, broader than the one I think you addressed in your thesis. Eric spent nearly 2 decades at Sun Microsystems and was recruited to be CEO of a little company called Google in August 2001. So much has changed since then. He remains on the board of Google's parent, Alphabet, where he served as chairman until last month. So let's start with Secretary Annan, who will make a few comments, and then let's have some comments from Eric Schmidt, and then we'll go into questions.
Thank you very much, Jane. I think we are taking on a very important topic this afternoon. My foundation has been focused on governance issues for a while, particularly elections. And we've been concerned that what we need is elections with integrity. Elections that are legitimate, which confers legitimacy on the winner, but also protects the loser. And as we look around the world, elections which are designed to be peaceful, to lead to peaceful and democratic rotation of leadership, these days leads to conflicts in many countries. And so 5 years ago, I set up a commission called the Commission on Elections, Democracy and Security to look into how one can push for elections with legitimacy. We looked into what is considered good elections, coming to conclusions that too much money in politics hollows out democracy. In fact, we use US as a bad example of how not to use money in politics. And I think quite a lot of the issues we discussed 5 years ago, some work has been done on it, but today we have issues which were not on the radar 5 years ago. Issues of the use of social media, people hacking into other systems. And of course, we have all this debate in the US of the Russian involvement in the elections. European countries are nervous. The Dutch, for example, handled the last elections all by hand because they were afraid there could be interference. How do you ensure that one can contain these excesses and get the people to understand that they are indeed electing their leaders without interference internally or from external sources? Because if you're not able to control it, and they have a sense that I'm going to vote, but somebody sitting somewhere can manipulate the system and give me a leader I didn't vote for, if you're not careful, people are going to lose trust in institutions, in the voting system, and the attitude will be, why bother to vote? And it does undermine not just institutions, but democracy itself. And this capacity to corral people into segments on the system and let them reinforce their prejudices and their views also makes it difficult for leaders to discuss and debate issues and agree on a compromise. And as a politician, you would know that if you don't have a certain common base and of understanding, it is extremely difficult to come to a compromise. So if everybody is locked in their sector with reinforced message, fake or not, and often you cannot tell what's the difference between fake and real. And indeed, if countries like the US are struggling with this, how will the poorer and the smaller countries manage? They're going to face the same phenomena, and in fact, they are facing it. We saw it in the elections in Indonesia, in the elections in Kenya, and it leads to conspiracy theories. So the question I'm asking, we need some control. Are we going to have to control social media the way we control radio, television, and other communication? Because obviously, this is not the first time a new technology had come to interfere. In their days, radio, television were considered revolutionary. And today we have social media. And I think what's also important, Jane, if I can go on to the point I was trying to make at MIT, that these are tools. Because I recall when the Arab Spring happened, everybody said, this is a social media revolution. They used social media to get the people to the Tahrir Square. But for lack of leadership, the revolution failed. The military came back and took charge and went back to the old ways and are doing things that Mubarak didn't even think of. And so we have to understand that leadership is even more important when we have these capacities. Maybe I should pause here and let Eric go. And
Okay.
I'll come back when you need me. Thanks.
We need you. Eric.
So it might be useful for me to sort of paint why my industry is changing so dramatically and some of the things that are going to be coming fairly soon. I've become convinced that we're entering a new age, and I'm going to call it a new age of intelligence, and that the combination of how humans and machines will work together will define almost everything that we deal with, that you all face as policymakers and so forth for the rest of our lives. And when we think about this, all of this needs to be done under a set of ethics and principles, which I'll talk about. We're already seeing people are going crazy over an explosion in healthcare using new techniques, which can be summarized as large amounts of data, you learn from the data, and you can do better than doctors. I'll give you an example of pathology. We can do better pathology reporting, better radiology. We can do better skin and dermatological testing. We can do better ophthalmological testing and so forth than humans can. So all of a sudden, the computer is better at some things that we didn't think it would be good at. And of course, these are not things that operate alone. In research, for example, we're at the cusp of understanding new things around gene expression, how certain new kinds of forms of chemistry works. Biology is still poorly understood, and these systems will allow us to track biological sequences and discover new biologies. There is a Nobel Prize in every one of these many, many times. It's also true in planning and efficiency. For example, we've demonstrated 15% improvement in data efficiency in terms of energy use. Imagine if you got 15% better energy use out of the global energy grid, the contribution that it would have for global warming and addressing all those issues. But the explosion in new discoveries, new materials and all of that is what is causing my side of the industry to be beside itself with optimism, which will create enormous new companies, enormous new opportunities all around the world. Now it's worth saying, by the way, that everyone immediately then wants to talk about all the sort of movie-inspired death scenarios, and I can confidently predict to you that they're at least 1 to 2 decades away. So you can worry about them, but let's worry about them in a while. So all the things that you see happen in movies, they might happen, but not anytime soon. And you use AI every day. For example, when you use Google Translate, that uses the same techniques. When you use Google Photos, it uses the same. Google Ads uses the same thing. Google Lens, which does a recognition of objects in pictures, does the same things. YouTube recommendations, when you're looking for what YouTube video to watch next, same thing. Self-driving cars, which will be coming relatively soon, use all of these tools. And by the way, they will save lives. So every startup in the world I live in now has the following model. Collect a whole bunch of data, run these algorithms on the data, get some new insight, and then sell it. And sell it for lots of money. And not all of them will succeed, but enough will be that this will continue for many years. Now, of course there are issues, right? Anything at this scale is going to have issues. By the way, the telephone had issues, and the telegraph had issues, and the trains had issues, and so forth. The issues here, there's a lot of concerns about jobs, for example, but if you look at the demographic problems, and in particular the dependency ratio of, for example, in Germany, right, in Northern Europe, right, in America, in China, in Japan, in Portugal, you name it, we're going to need these tools to make the declining percentage of workers be able to increase their productivity to make GDP grow faster. So we're going to need these for all sorts of reasons as well. Now, another issue that everyone's concerned about is the relationship with news. And our position has been to try to strengthen it. And we need news and we need legitimate news. And we are, for example, funding initiatives to fight fake news using various tools. We have all sorts of technologies which go under the name of DNI and AMP that people are using, and we do various fact-check terms and so forth and so on that you can do this. The fact of the matter is that when we detect this stuff, we can demote it, right? We don't censor it, but we can put the stuff which is more likely to be legit on the top. Now, there are other initiatives within the industry that are also important. There's an initiative called FIDO, which is where we're exchanging identity information so that the online world can detect if this is a fake identity, and in particular a dangerous one. There's a global internet group for counterterrorism, which is also exchanging the identities and IP addresses of known bad actors, right, to try to share all of this. All happening with the knowledge and support of the governments, but under the private sector. And we're obviously doing other things, teaching coding and those sorts of things. And there's this whole AI ethics activity called Partnership for AI. Perhaps relevant to what the Secretary General just talked about, we have a group inside of Alphabet called Jigsaw, which got ahead of this relatively early with a set of tools to originally protect journalists from being attacked from people who wanted to shut down their voices. That's called SHIELD. We used AI techniques to detect hate speech. And we now have an API called Perspective, which allows you to determine the percentage of hate you wish to have in your conversation. right? We're all about choice. High hate, low hate, medium hate, good day, bad day, right? You name it. We have a program which will allow you to determine suspected ISIS and other sort of terrorist sites and actually flood them with counter information with the hope that maybe they'll change their minds. We have some success with that. This whole product is called Protect Your Election. And amazingly, not only does it work, but it's been used so far in Germany, France, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Korea, and it will be heavily used in 2018 in the American elections because we expect a great deal of skullduggery along the way. So we are getting ready for this. Now, to finish, and I want to be very much acknowledge the strength of your point. What's next? Well, there's lots of good news, right? So these discoveries are going to continue. The world is getting more digitized. People are becoming more transparent. It's all good, right? Well, what's an example of something bad? In the last year or two, technology has been invented that will allow you to swap the face of anyone for anyone else without being able to detect it, and also then change their voice into anyone else's voice, okay? So since we know, one of the things we know about humans is mere exposure to the video affects their motivation, diminishes their likelihood to vote, causes them to become prejudiced against an idea or not open to something. The fact that it will be possible for evil players to make completely fake videos, right? Imagine what that will do in future elections. And of course, we're gearing up to detect, fight, block, and prevent that. Jane?
So on that terrifying note, I confessed early, hello, John, that I'm a recovering politician and I also have an analog mind. So approaching this from that perspective, it almost seems as though the two of you live on different planets. And Eric, you mentioned some tools that affect elections, but you didn't mention governance. And here's my question. Secretary Annan talked about something that was real. In the Arab Spring, to remind us all, which never was a spring, we thought might be a spring, which was more of a winter, social media tools were used. Crowdsourcing tools were used to topple governments. I mean, it started with a frustrated fruit vendor who immolated himself, and that became viral, and a number of governments fell. The people who toppled those governments knew how to use those tools. What they didn't know how to do was stand up another government. And in fact, some of them, in Egypt, for example, because I went there several times right after the election, said, I hate politics. I don't want to have anything to do with politics. So now in Egypt, in case anyone missed the movie, there is a government that's not, I don't think, what these mostly kids envisioned. So question about this. How does this revolution, or how could this revolution responsibly affect politics beyond making sure voting machines work? And specifically, to return to the quote that you made some time ago, technology does not free us of the need for leadership. It makes leadership all the more important. If Secretary Guterres were to call either of you and say, give me some advice on how I can use technology responsibly to make the UN a better organization and to get a Nobel Peace Prize like that guy Annan got, what would you tell him?
Well, that's a tough question. No, I think you are right that leadership is absolutely essential. But if we accept that we do have the tools, and these tools are not going to solve our problem, they will help us if we use them effectively. The other issue we need to understand, which I didn't have time to comment on, is some of the leaders in authoritarian governments have also decided to restrain the use of these tools. And some really have not only blocked it, but they use it to control their people. And the question that is going to come up, are these social media instruments, are they instruments of emancipation or control? Depending upon where you sit, you may see it as the Secretary General of the UN. Obviously, he will have to work with his member states to deal with the issue as internally and externally. What I would want to ask is, we've talked about what can be done in the US, what's going to be done in Europe. There's a big world out there. Some of them have no capacity, but they face the same problems. Can there be an international system of how we regulate and control the use of these systems and ensure that the abuses are limited? Can governments agree on this? Or Eric, you think each government can take its own initiative to contain the abuses, make sure hate speeches are not there? Yeah.
Well, to you, Eric, you describe a world where industry is trying to be more responsible, and you've mentioned several things that it's doing. But basic to, at least as I hear it, to what you're saying is industry needs to be free to make these decisions itself. How do you, if Secretary Guterres calls you and says, how can the private sector help me to manage this collection of countries in the world responsibly, what do you tell him?
I understand the appeal of regulation by a government. The problem is that when you actually ask people what regulation would they like, they usually prefer to not have whatever that government's regulation was on them. So I think we're better off letting the industry address these challenges, which are real and are being well discussed with them, is my own view. And I can clearly speak for that Google and Alphabet spend a lot of time on this. And I know that Twitter and Facebook are obsessing about it as well. They have a different set of problems. So the way I would answer your question is I would say, I operate under the principle that in an internet-connected world, the first principle is one of transparency. And that governments that are hiding political speech and political thought and political facts are probably not serving their citizens well. So I start with that. The second thing that I think when you asked about what industry should do, is the industry's got to do a better job of distinguish between real identity and fake identity, right? Is this a real human being or a fake human being? Mm-hmm. And there are technical ways of doing that. The typical problem that drives political leaders absolutely crazy is you get, and people won't say it, but there's always somebody who's in a large political group who's just crazy wrong, mm-hmm. right? But nobody listens to them. But now all of a sudden, they have an amplifier. Exactly. They have a tool. They have a way. Right. So an example would be they create a bot. And that bot amplifies their voice every 2 seconds. Well, there's an awful lot of them compared to me because I don't have time to turn on my bot because I'm busy being a normal adult, right?
Or you don't even know it's a bot.
Yes, and indeed, so determining, for example, if you're communicating with a bot, or whether you're communicating with somebody who's published fake news, right, but who's a legitimate human, those are technical questions that can be worked on. So we're clear, I'm in favor of free speech for humans, not robots, right?
Are you aware of the new German law that you need to take fake news and others off as quickly as possible, pay as much as 50 million euros?
Yes, and indeed we are working very hard to comply with that law.
Let me just ask for a show of hands. I know we're going to get into these issues in more depth, but we have two different views here. One is that transparency is the best regulator of this future that we now live in, and the other is that there should be some agreement or an effort to get some agreement internationally on a set of regulations. So I know I've oversimplified, but I'm just curious what people think. How many people think transparency is the better way to go? And how many people think some form of international regulation is the better way to go? Well, Eric, you're losing.
I claim it was 50-50,
Okay.
especially when I count all the Google employees in the
all
room.
Right. All right, I have one more question because this audience is going to have so many questions, and it's about AI. Some people think AI is, well, AI is here, so we all know that. But let me start with you, Eric. Are humans going to stay in charge of AI, or is AI going to win this race?
You've been watching too many movies. Okay, so let me be clear that humans will remain in charge of this for the rest of time.
Would you agree?
Yes, to some extent, I agree. Let me say that we need to get people to understand, particularly with the disruptive impact of technology and AI, that technology is here to help them and not to replace them. As a politician, if you were to go and confront your constituents and to say that driverless car is coming to the US, and you have about 2 million Americans who make their living driving, and logically speaking, they will lose their jobs. Would you be able to convince these people that technology and AI is helping them or replacing them? And what sort of discussion should be taking place in society, explaining to the people, you're losing the jobs you have now, but according to Eric, there'll be better jobs for you. You'll be trained for it. We'll prepare. That discussion is also not taking place. And the political leaders are not saying much about that.
Well, I think that as a recovering political leader, we're all learning at our peril that ignoring those voices and that anxiety is you pay a high price for ignoring that. So I think people are paying more attention. All right, we're going to ask questions, and I'm looking at, I don't know if he wants to ask one, but Oliver Grimson, who was actually the president of a country, since we're having this political conversation. The country is Iceland, and I wonder if you have any observation or question.
Well, I primarily came to listen, and but since you put me on the spot, we went through a financial crisis, as some of you might remember.
Oh, yes.
And for a while we were exhibit number one of a failed financial system. But Iceland is a very peaceful country, very democratic country with a high level of political involvement. But this breakdown of the financial system created a social and political, almost a revolution in our country, which was primarily driven by people who had no political position, who came out of nowhere, so to speak, if you look at the political system, and were, like in the Arab Spring, empowered by Facebook and social media to create demonstrations outside the parliament, to organize petitions, to bring down a government, and to create a political crisis in one of the most peaceful democratic countries in Europe, which none of us in leadership could ever have imagined. So we witnessed there firsthand that it doesn't matter how stable your democracy is, these new instruments created instant politics of the highest level, which threatened almost every political institution. And like in the Arab Spring, it didn't lead to a new leadership, although we are seeing political parties coming into the Icelandic parliament, and one sits behind me actually, who was elected by one of those parties. That would not have been created if it hadn't been for this technological transformation. So quite frankly, I don't think you can control it. And my conclusion was that this is a new level of politics that none of us in elected positions could ever have predicted, and none of us know how to deal with, but it's a reality whether it's in Egypt or Iceland or the United States, and whether we like it or not, it's going to stay.
Yeah. Well, can you control, Eric, it sounds like you can, through transparency, the fake part of social media, or the use of bots, or the, well, let's start with that. Can you control the bad side?
It should be possible to mark and rank information that's false or misleading, fake, what have you. We do this all the day at Google, and we have ranking, and our signals are good enough that information that's completely false is typically not on the first page. So I think we've worked that out. So I think it's possible. What I think is interesting, Mr. President, is when I study the youngest politicians, political leaders around the world, who are in their 30s, they are extremely well connected on social media. And they, for example, tweet every 30 seconds some idea. And they reply to their constituents on Twitter. They do all sorts of YouTube videos. They're very heavily prevalent on Instagram and Facebook. So I wonder if the newest generation of leadership will come up with new ways of addressing this hyper-connected, hyper-transparent world.
I just point out we have a 71-year-old president who tweets regularly.
I won't be. I'm not going to be discussing President Trump.
Oh. Let's go to some other questions. Peter Bashar.
Jane, if I can raise
yeah,
just one issue.
Yes, just
throw
hold it
on the
for
table.
a second, Peter.
You know, big data.
Yep.
You know, and who owns it? How do you control it? How is it used? What impact does it have on individual privacy and all that? These are big questions also coming up, and particularly the way some governments are using big data. And I see Ken also wanted.
That's certainly true. Peter.
Eric, it's so exciting to listen to you talk about the promise of AI in advancing medical discoveries. In the U.S., we're grappling with this epidemic of gun violence. Have you given thought to whether there's any application of AI to reduce gun violence?
I have. It's called increasing the intelligence of the leaders who should vote for some gun controls. So, for example, the AR-15 rifle that will spray a whole room, maybe we should regulate that a little bit. But I'm speaking on my own view and not for the entire AI community, who probably all agree with me. The good news about gun violence is it's extremely rare. And therefore, the number of events and activities are so rare, they're unlikely to be trainable. So the key thing about our current state of algorithms is you need a great deal of training data. So human biology, lots of training data. Astrophysics, lots of training data. Traffic, lots of training data. Gun violence, terrorism, horrific things that occur very rarely, not very much data, good thing, not likely to be perturbed by AI.
But can't we make guns now, talking about technology, where only the owner of the gun can use it?
Yes, that's not an AI problem. That's an intelligence problem by the gun manufacturers.
But it's a way to do something without...
It would be easy to put a trigger lock, but not to be terrifying here, but you can imagine a gun that had AI could also never miss, right?
Right.
So these, and I'm obviously not encouraging that. So the tools can be used in both ways. The solution to the gun violence problem is to have fewer guns, especially not in the hands of untrained people.
Third row, over here.
Thank you. My name is Peter Young, and I'm an angel investor. I have a question to Eric Schmidt. What's your view on the development of AI in China with this particular program of the Chinese government and the views someone like Kai-Fu Lee, whom you know probably pretty well, has about this?
So Kai-Fu worked for us for years.
I know.
So the Chinese government has announced that it has a strategy to catch up by the year 2020 and to be the best in the world and dominate the AI research and businesses by 2030. So it's a national program. As I understand what that means in China is that there will be hundreds of thousands of engineers produced and trained in this. There is no analogous United States or European doctrine, and we need to have one.
Front row, Jutta Issinger, did you have a question? Yes.
Hi, I have a question to Eric. How could disruptive digital tools revive democracy and maybe create new methods of real participation?
One of the problems seems to be that it's easier to discourage someone from voting than to encourage them to vote. So maybe, Secretary General, you could talk about this, but it appears that if Jared is the candidate, and I don't like Jared, I do like Jared, but let's say I don't like Jared. If I
not
just
sure I
start
like
telling
Jared.
you, well, so Jane doesn't like him. So Jane decides to attack Jared. So Jane comes up with a story, and they're kind of half true, and they bombard you. All they have to do is to prevent you from voting. They don't have to get you to vote for someone else. But you say, well, maybe that Jared guy is not so good. So we have a problem in that the negative techniques that are discouraging, right, need to be supplanted by something that encourages people to actively want to vote. Right? I don't know how to solve that problem.
But that's a very hard problem, seriously. As voter suppression is not just blocking people from voting, it's making them disgusted with the whole process, and it works really, really well.
So, and if you see, many of the nation-state tactics seem to be to sow discord throughout the country, which causes people to have less faith in their institutions. If you have less faith in your institutions, you're less likely to participate. Mr. Secretary General.
And so one of the reasons I don't like Jared is that he blocked me from seeing Ken Roth, who's been trying to ask a question. Ken Roth, who heads Human Rights Watch. I'm kidding.
It's all Jared's fault. Now, Eric, this is for you. I wanted to follow up on how we deal with fake news, and let's leave aside the bot thing because I realize that there's no right to a bot. Although I would say there's a right to have an anonymous identity online because so many repressive governments don't let you speak freely if you have your real identity. But I really don't know how to deal with the fake news because to say, oh, we'll just let the public decide. It becomes very politicized. You see the Wikipedia problem in certain pages that they just have to freeze. If you say, well, the company will decide, how do you decide? I mean, I just, to test this, I actually just Googled measles vaccine dangers. And the first item that came up was something that said that measles vaccine cause everything from autism to death, which is completely false. So I don't pretend that this is easy, but what have you done and where do you see this could go so that we can more effectively deal with fake news?
So fake news is a series of problems. So one is that you have websites that are full of falsehoods. Another one is that they get spread virally. So let me posit that if there is one person who writes a fake news post that nobody reads, while that's annoying, that's not what we're talking about. What we're really talking about is the amplification of falsehoods. So this can be detected in a number of ways. You can detect, for example, the rate of sharing and then look at it and say, is this legit or is somebody paying for this? There have been cases where people have purchased fake followers, fake users, and so forth. Those can be policed and so forth. That can put a throttle on it. In our case, in YouTube, we had a problem where we would surface YouTube videos that were like the ones you were watching. And so there's a category of videos which we suspect are not completely truthful, but we don't want to censor them. When they pop up, we stopped recommending the next one, right? So it's there and you can find it, but we're not trying to add to that amplification phase. So I don't think we'll be able to completely eliminate fake news because of this lone wolf problem, but I think we'll become much better at making it not a common phenomena. And under this new German law that the Secretary General mentioned, we have an affirmative responsibility of actually not showing fake news within, I think, a 24-hour period.
Let me just ask, this may be fake news, but during the last election cycle, so I read in True or Fake News, Russian entities using rubles were buying advertising, I think it was advertising, on various social media sites. Did no bells and whistles go off about that?
I don't believe that was about the Google advertising system. I think that was about another vendor.
Okay.
But in our case, we put in a for 2016, and we will continue this. We put in a verified buyer program, and we put in a whitelist, and so we had de minimis of that kind of a problem.
So that's, again, the transparency option. In the back, in the middle, or were you just taking video? What are you doing? You're holding your cell phone up? Okay. Amos Yadlin.
This is for Secretary Annan. For years, we have a democracy of representation. We vote for people that we believe have enough knowledge and enough time to implement their policies. Technology is taking us back to the square, to the town square, where everybody has a voice, and it's come immediately. How you deal with the effect of, which is, I think, most of the time is problematic, this effect on the democracy as we know it.
I mean that you have to respond instantly, and you don't have the time lag to be able to. I think the leaders obviously will have to set up mechanisms and systems to be able to analyze the information coming to them. And I think when most leaders, including myself when I was in the Secretariat, would have loved the old days when you got the message, came by boat and a horse brought it to you and you had time to think and then send it back. But people want instant information, and we have to adapt. The leaders have to adapt and work themselves, have to analyze the information coming to them and get back very quickly. And unfortunately, speed is going to continue. I'm told that in Silicon Valley, the creed used to be, speed is God. It hasn't hit us yet, but you're pushing us in that direction too.
Yeah. I don't think that's a government mantra yet.
No.
I wouldn't say. Third row over here, and then in the middle in the front row.
Thank you very much. I have two different questions for each
Identify
one of you.
yourself,
Yes,
please.
so my name is Birgitta Jónsdóttir. I am one of these agitators in Iceland that participated in the protest, created political movements, got into parliament, and created a party that was the second biggest in Iceland called the Pirate Party. But I've also been advocating a lot for awareness for democracy in the digital era among policymakers. And, you know, frankly speaking, we're so way behind. And this is one of the reasons I quit Parliament, because I feel that I can't move quickly enough there. But, you know, we talk a lot about, in this fireside talk is about democracy in the digital era. And we haven't really addressed at all the pillars of democracy. What are they? You know, Eric, you don't like privacy for individuals, as far as I can understand.
I didn't say that.
Well, it's been said.
Please don't put words in my mouth.
Yeah, but it's been said in other speeches.
Well, then, no, but please don't bait me. Ask a question.
Okay, I will.
That's
hang
direct.
on. I have the word now. And the United Nations actually did some remarkable work in addressing privacy issues in the UN Charter when it comes to digital privacy. But where are we going next? Because we are now dealing with algorithms and artificial intelligence that are discriminating in many ways, and there is no transparency about what is being put into these algorithms that actually will have a huge impact on the fates of people. So it's sort of assimilating with our faulty data, because we're not perfect.
So let's ask about that.
But I want to do this is for Kofi Annan. And then for you, Eric, since you want...
Maybe you ask him a question, and then I'll
Was that
ask
a
me
comment or a question?
A question about where to go
question.
next in, you know, dealing with policy for the pillars of democracy.
Okay.
And what are pillars of democracy? And is there any difference between digital reality and ordinary reality when it comes to the UN Charter for Human Rights?
All right.
I don't really know where to begin. But let me say that we are living through a period of rapid change. And we have to accept that and adapt and change with it. Because if we don't, I'm not sure I agree with Eric that one should leave the companies to self-administer and control themselves. Because I doubt that some of the changes he has referred to and we have seen would have come about if they had not been called to Washington to testify, to explain what was going. It would have been wonderful when they got to Washington, were to say, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, you are worrying about a problem we have solved. That wasn't the case, which really they have the means and the tools to do it. And I think as it's going to move fast and we're going to go through more changes, we have to come to some understanding as to how we relate to these things. Obviously, transparency is a powerful tool, but I'm not sure transparency alone is enough. We did not, when radio came, television, media, we didn't say leave it to transparency to regulate them or leave them to regulate themselves. And my sense is that sooner or later we are going to have to do the same on social media. Then whether you do it nationally or you have an international code which helps everybody, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we had that conversation a little bit ago, but the other part of your question was about the pillars of democracy, and I think you could define democracy in several ways. One is democracy as a form of government. Another is democracy in terms of participation by everyone in not just civic life, but in a world in which, as Eric was describing it, medical records and so many other things are under their personal control.
No, let's take the basic element of democracy where the people have to have a say on how they are governed and by whom. So if you start fooling around with the election and the selection process, you are really undermining democracy. And this is what makes this a special issue extremely important.
Did you want to say anything, Eric?
I'm not sure what your question was for me.
Okay. All right. Well, we want to, I'm not sure when this panel ends, but I'm assuming it's 6 o'clock. So I would like 5. Well, we have one gentleman here, and I'll give the 2 participants a chance to wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Salil Shetty. I'm the Secretary General of Amnesty International. So my question is primarily for Eric, and Amnesty has been dragged into the whole space of technology and human rights because a lot of the defenders we are fighting for are now being attacked online. We've joined the Partnership for AI as well. And but I wanted to really ask you about the whole issue about, and I'm as hesitant to allow governments to be regulating on all of these issues because they would love to clamp down on free speech, etc. But having said that, I mean, if you take 1 or 2 areas where AI is quite advanced now is, for example, if you take automated weapon systems, we are very nervous about what's happening there. We've called for a preemptive ban, and at least more than 20 governments have joined us on that. You take another area like predictive policing. We are discovering that algorithms reinforce biases. So the question is, how do we expect transparency, which we expect from governments, how do we see that also coming from companies, and how can companies play God on this?
Great closing question. And why don't you both try to answer parts of it and wrap up in terms of any other comments you want to make?
One of the most important things, research that's going on now, is trying to understand how to eliminate biases that might creep into these algorithms. Because if they're trained with biased data, they will have biases in them. The other point that I want to remind everyone is these technologies have serious errors in them and therefore should not be used for life-critical decisions. So I would not want to be in an airplane where the computer was making all the general intelligence decisions about flying yet. The technology is just not reliable enough. There are too many errors in its use. It's advisory, it makes you smarter and so forth, but I wouldn't put it in charge of command and control. My general statement here is that my industry is about to go through some enormous transitions because of the power of this technology. These will lower prices, increase lifespans, improve healthcare, improve reach, and so forth. And they are profound. It does come with issues, right? So I don't want to minimize them, but please remember that there's an overwhelming benefit from being smarter in many of these areas.
No, I was going to say that I'm encouraged by comments by Eric, because there has been some concern that there's too much concentration of power in a handful of companies who control the social media and innovation. I think that can be an advantage, and it can also be a disadvantage. It can be an advantage in the sense that if the companies are forward-looking, recognize the problems, and want to work to correct them, as Eric has said, and sometimes even reach out with governments in public-private partnership to resolve some of these issues, we can move much faster and be able to iron out some of the difficulties that Shetty has raised. If we do not do that and get into adversarial situation where the companies are holding on to their proprietary things and position and consider what the governments are seeking them, asking them to do a serious interference and resist, then we are going to be in a very serious situation. But I think people are beginning to wonder if we are not entering an Orwellian world where lots of data and information is in the hands of Big Brother, of governments who can use it as they want without the people and those who own that information having anything to do about it.
Well, I think that this conversation will continue. If we'd had it last year, there would be much less sophistication than there is this year. And clearly the worlds of government and the worlds and the private sector world have to connect, and these issues have to be wrestled with more. So next year when this panel is held, I think we'll all be smarter and have more information. And I think each panelist brought some very important insights to this. Please thank them both, Kofi Annan and Eric Schmidt.